A polemical essay is an argumentative essay, but it's a one-sided argument. A polemicist supports a single position and won't entertain anyone who holds a contrary opinion. The word polemic itself comes from the Greek and means warlike or related to war. Many scholars have assigned polemical writers to the dustbin of history. They're seen as simplistic, dogmatic, histrionic, and incredibly partisan. The British journalist Nick Cohen jokes that writers seeking lasting fame are much more likely to find it if they produce romance, children's stories, heist capers, or sword and sorcery fantasies, any form imaginable, as long as it is not a polemic. And truth be told, there's a reason to doubt the polemic as a convincing rhetorical form. And that's because many polemicists were, and are, fanatics. Polemics are the go-to form if a writer wants to rant and rage, carp and cry, or just tick people off. Polemical essays originally came out of the medieval period when some members of the clergy made impassioned arguments on theological disputes, such as whether a small group of elected souls would be the only ones to go to heaven, or whether Catholics or Protestants should be the ones burned at the stake. Across the Renaissance into our own era, polemicists started to take on more secular controversies. These included such hot-button topics as whether slavery was justified by God, whether the Americas were substandard to Europe, or whether women were innately inferior. For centuries then, a good deal of religious and political dispute has been dominated by polemicists. These authors have peddled fear, anger, and hate in their writings. From the beginning, polemical essayists were also spin doctors and publicists. With the rise of print culture in Europe and North America in the 18th and 19th centuries, polemical writers took to pamphlets as their primary means of circulating aggression. Pamphlets were cheap to print and could be distributed in the street, in front of churches and theaters to a large number of people. That is why even today the word pamphleteer has something of a negative connotation. A pamphleteer is thought of as a hothead who blatantly attacks others' ideas. Early polemicists took to the streets in other ways as well. They gave spontaneous speeches standing on boxes and barrels in public squares, spouting their views on whether the working class was a scourge to society or whether all of humanity was going to hell. In our own day and age, we continue to refer to those who make impassioned, biased declarations on gun control or on prostitution as soapboxers. The term refers to those who metaphorically stand on a soapbox as they preach their views to others. Of course, modern-day polemicists usually don't use pamphlets anymore, and generally speaking, they don't stand on soapboxes in the street. Instead, they circulate their opinions on the internet, and so we may call our current polemicists trolls. These are writers who deliberately post antagonistic messages on online forums with the express purpose of trying to antagonize people. These trolls often make deliberately offensive claims that are every bit as simplistic, dogmatic, histrionic, and partisan as those of the fanatical soapboxers of earlier ages. What I want to suggest, however, is that you can write a polemical essay without being a fanatic or a troll. I'm going to go one step further and say that polemics have their place in smart social discourse. Being opinionated when taking on certain social issues can actually be a clever rhetorical strategy. This is particularly true when the issue you're writing about is highly politicized or polarizing. Issues such as abortion, pornography, the death penalty, vegetarianism, global warming, racial profiling, or images of women in the media. Just hearing me list these possible polemical topics probably raises your blood pressure. And of course, that's the point. A smart polemicist doesn't shy away from writing about volatile issues. On the other hand, a smart polemicist also knows that there's a difference between ranting on these topics and making persuasive arguments about them. Think of the politically savvy and often strategically humorous polemicists who use their trolling as a means of disrupting other people's prejudice, ignorance, and hate. And you might also think about intelligent polemicists from the past who changed people's minds and hearts on important social issues through their passionate entreaties. Thomas Paine's Rights of Man convinced people to throw off the yoke of tyranny when a government doesn't protect the rights of its citizens. Mary Wollstonecraft's vindication of the rights of women was pivotal in persuading people that women should have access to formal education. So, if you can be reasonable as well as impassioned, and if your aim is to make a case for an unpopular stance that could potentially benefit others, then the polemical essay might be for you. Even some literary historians have started to come around to the polemical essay. In his book, Inventing Polemic, scholar Jesse Lander makes a compelling case for the polemic as a foundational genre in creating modern civilization as we know it. Lander points out that polemicists have long urged social reform. And it's true that if writers from the Renaissance to the modern period accomplished anything, they've certainly helped reform all aspects of society, from religion and government to medicine and laws protecting the oppressed, and even to writing itself. Lander makes clear that early polemicists were responsible for creating what we now call literature, although this happened in a sort of roundabout way. Because early polemicists incited a cultural backlash, they cleared the way for a rise in polite learning, meaning the poetry and prose that we now think of as literary. In other words, people became more interested in the kinds of writing that tends to elevate readers by exciting their empathy, rather than writing that smashes readers over the head with its vitriolic arguments. Lander explains that the volatile mixture of religious controversy and print technology in England and Europe introduced a new polemical element into literary culture. And the invention of this polemic in turn produced a reaction against it in the form of polite learning, or an understanding of literature as sweetness and light, rather than scorn and spleen. So in a weird way, I suppose it's possible to say that all forms of the essay, the memoir, the epistolary, the historical, the public intellectual, all of them are indebted to polemics for their existence. So, in thinking about and perhaps writing your own polemical essays, the key is to believe that you are right. That said, you also have to refrain from beating the reader over the head with your rightness. Wrath and rage are not what's called for, even though it's true that a polemic is warlike. Polemical essays are forceful, and some are fierce in tone. But to be persuasive, a polemicist also needs to be strategic in wielding such passion. Let me offer you a case in point. One early American polemicist is Jonathan Edwards. At first he was quite successful, but ultimately he failed when he became too strident. Edwards was an 18th century Congregationalist minister from Massachusetts. He was instrumental in launching what's now called the Great Awakening in America. In essence, the Great Awakening was a revitalization of evangelical Christianity that swept through England, Europe, and the New World in the 1730s and 40s. During these years, Edwards wrote and delivered many sermons on redemption and the workings of God's grace. Almost all of these are polemical essays. And in point of fact, the polemic tends to attract those who make moral arguments. Since the form has the potential to be highly persuasive, even secular polemicists often write about moral issues, whether that's making a case to give victims of devastating viruses access to free medicine, or making the argument that it's inhumane to incarcerate drug addicts. The polemic that Jonathan Edwards is best known for is a sermon entitled "Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God." Edwards delivered it at Enfield, Connecticut in 1741. The piece was then published as a pamphlet and distributed widely. There's no doubt that what Edwards has to say about sinners and salvation is combative and inflammatory. It is polemical in every way. Edward takes it upon himself to be God's mediator, and he contends that there is only one true path to salvation. As a Calvinist, Edwards believed in predestination, meaning that only those whom God had already chosen would go to heaven. Edwards further believed that only those church members who had undergone tests of faith should be allowed to participate in communion, which he saw as a seal of God's covenant with the chosen, not as a means of being saved. So, sinners in the hands of an angry God is Edwards' attempt to speak to members of his church who hadn't yet taken this test of faith. But he also wanted to elicit a strong reaction from those who had passed such a test and were complacent, thinking they didn't have to worry because they were already saved. In this way, Edwards was able to cast all of his audience, church members and non-members alike, as sinners. And he warned that each and every one of them was in danger of being cast into hell by an unforgiving and wrathful God. And here's the thing. Edwards' view of hell is one that even a non-believer would want to avoid. He called it a place where eternal flames do now rage and glow, and where the devil stands ready to fall upon sinners and seize them as his own. Edwards' take on God is also unpleasant. God is a pretty vengeful guy, eager to cast souls into this fiery furnace. For instance, Edward wrote that this angry God will crush you under his feet without mercy. He'll crush out your blood and make it fly, and it shall be sprinkled on his garments, so as to stain all his raiment. God will not only hate you, but he will have you in the utmost contempt. No place shall be thought fit for you, but under his feet to be trodden down as the mire of the streets. If the image of God crushing out a church member's blood and making it fly wasn't bad enough, Edwards went on to say that it was only God's whim that kept the congregation from tumbling into hell, and that sooner or later, God would let them fall into that flaming pit. Edwards said that the descent into hell was as easy and as inevitable as a rock tearing through a spider's web or a foot slipping through a rotten bridge. The God that holds you over the pit of hell, Edwards warned, is the same one who abhors you and is dreadfully provoked. His wrath toward you burns like fire. He looks upon you as worthy of nothing else but to be cast into this fire, and you are 10,000 times more abominable in his eyes, as the most hateful, venomous serpent is in ours. And absolutely no one was immune to the wrath that Edwards described. Well, none except Edwards himself. Impending doom, he promised, is the dismal case of every soul in this congregation that has not been born again, however moral and strict, sober and religious they may otherwise be. Oh, that you would consider it, whether you be young or old. There is reason to think that there are many in this congregation now hearing this discourse that will actually be the subjects of this very misery to all eternity. We know not who they are or in what seat they sit, and it would be no wonder if some person that now sits here in some seat at this meeting house should be in hell before tomorrow morning. Hearing this, it's easy to understand why the people listening to the sermon were said to be moved to a breathing of distress and much weeping. Even though Edwards never shouted, apparently he read his polemical sermon aloud in a quiet, measured voice. Nonetheless, his message was persuasive because he personalized his argument. He made the threat of hell intimate and close. No, Edwards didn't talk in sweeping generalizations about God or damnation. Instead, he sought to demonstrate God's rage by providing listeners with vivid and grotesque images of how God would kill them, as he would worms or spiders or snakes. And he warned that God's wrath burns like fire. These choices were specific and deliberate. Edwards didn't want his congregation just to hear the words fire or anger. He wanted them to feel burned, to be seared and scorched by these words. So he was being a sensationalist, but one with a clear purpose. I also want to point out that Edwards used the second person, saying that God hates you, not some vague sinner out there somewhere. While his sermon began in the third person, talking about people and Israelites and sinners, as he moved into the second half of his polemic, he relentlessly pointed at his listeners and said, you, and you. This turn to the second person is really effective when Edwards brings his argument into the current moment. He switches his verb tense from past to present and repeats the word now, now, now. He even goes so far as to insinuate that someone sitting in the pews right at that moment would find himself in hell before the next morning. With these examples, I trust it's clear why Edwards was such a powerful polemicist and why he was, for a time, the most popular preacher in New England. On the other hand, it shouldn't be terribly surprising that his congregation eventually ran him out on a rail. His criticisms were too personal, and his arguments must have seemed somewhat hypocritical, because even though his polemics packed a powerful punch, he himself was clearly on one side, headed for heaven, while his congregation was on the other, bound for hell. So when he started calling out families and humiliating them as backsliders, and when he insisted that no one could take communion who hadn't publicly declared himself saved, his congregation took a vote on whether or not to keep him. And with 200 in favor and 20 opposed, Edwards was dismissed. And that's the danger of being a polemical essayist. When your attacks come across as too personal, aimed directly at your readers, then you too are likely to be dismissed. Okay, before you think I've somehow proven it impossible to be a successful polemicist, let's fast forward to a more current example. The writer Laura Kipnis has built her career around writing polemical essays. She takes unpopular stances on contentious social issues, particularly about sex and gender. Kipnis has weighed in on many a divisive topic, including whether trigger warnings should be used on college campuses, whether pornography encourages sex crimes, and why Americans love a good scandal. It's her argument that it's we voyeurs, and not the perpetrators, who are responsible for feeding the culture of scandal that dominates so much of our national news. So, of course, Kipnis is something of a controversial figure. She's been called cheeky and deliberately hyperbolic and unafraid of offending the cause of political correctness. Now, I've met Laura Kipnis, and I can attest that she is passionate about what she argues and is deliberately confrontational. She is also unapologetic in her choice to write polemics. She actually has a book on the futility of pursuing romantic love called Against Love, a Polemic. This book begins, "Please fasten your seatbelts. We are about to encounter contradictions. The subject is love, and things may get bumpy. To begin with, who would dream of being against love? Hence the necessity for a polemic against it. Polemics exist to poke holes in cultural pieties and turn received wisdom on its head, even about sacrosanct subjects like love. Polemicists overstate the case because they're arguing against something so unquestionable and deeply entrenched. It's the only way to make a dent in the usual story." Here, Kipnis is trying to show us that the polemic is ideal for promoting opinions that are universally disliked. They're ideal for times when a writer's belief will brand her as a heretic at worst and eccentric at best. So you might think of the polemicist as an intellectual provocateur. This means that any polemical essay is inherently political, even if it's not overtly about politics. 2 years before publishing her book Against Romantic Love, Kipnis wrote a New York Times essay called Love in the 21st Century, in which she distilled the main ideas of what became her longer project. It is a polemical essay, and in it, Kipnis grapples with how romantic love has become a kind of political morality in its socially sanctioned form of marriage. So her polemic is against marriage as much as it's against love. Kipnis actually turns to adulterers as the real truth-tellers on the subject of romance. She believes that these are the people who might fully understand that marital monogamy is soul-killing. Will all the adulterers in the audience please stand up? Kipnis asks. You know who you are. Don't be embarrassed. Adulterers aren't just playing around, she says. Adulterers are homegrown closet social theorists, because adultery is not just a referendum on the sustainability of monogamy. It is a veiled philosophical discussion about the social contract of romantic love itself. Pretty nervy to champion the honesty of adulterers in the New York Times. I might even go so far as to say that it's audacious. But Laura Kipnis, as well as other contemporary polemicists, such as Jonathan Safran Foer and the late Gore Vidal, are willing to take such risks. They do so in the name of trying to get people to wake up and smell the ideological coffee. In Jonathan Safran Foer's example, that ideology is the unexamined belief that meat eating is natural and that people are superior to animals. For Gore Vidal, it was mindlessly accepting the idea that homosexuals face fewer oppressions than other groups, such as Jews. Okay, back to Kipnis. In her polemical essay on love and marriage, she argues that the expectation that sexual attraction can last a lifetime is a romantic fantasy, particularly given all of the hard evidence to the contrary. As evidence, Kipnis cites divorce rates and the percentage of people, men and women alike, who will admit, if they can do so anonymously, that they've had an affair. Kipnis flat out disagrees with the belief that long-term relationships sustain long-term desire. Instead, she argues, the parties involved must work at keeping passion alive, the presumption being that even after living in close proximity to someone for a length of time, you will still muster the requisite desire to achieve sexual congress on a regular basis. And it is true, many couples do manage to perform enough psychic retooling to reshape the anarchy of desire to the confines of the marriage bed, plugging away at the task year after year like diligent assembly line workers. And so, concludes Kipnis, we have the erotic life of a nation of workaholics. If sex seems like work, clearly you're not working hard enough at it. Now, obviously, Kipnis wants to provoke her readers, many of whom are married or hope to get married. To compare marital sex with endless, mindless drudgery is her polemical attempt to get readers to rethink their need to be married. And by clapping adulterers on the back for acting on their sexual desires, she's also trying to get her readers to rethink the scandal of adultery as an act of erotic integrity. Kipnis is turning the tables on marital monogamy, and she's offending all kinds of readers in the process. Now, there are potentially negative consequences when you offend people. Kipnis found herself at the center of a media frenzy when she claimed in a nationally published article that students and staff at college campuses were in a state of sexual paranoia. In an article for the Chronicle of Higher Education, she wrote, "In the post-Title IX landscape, sexual panic rules. Gropers become rapists, and accusers become survivors, and even an unfunny joke is likely to create lasting trauma." Kipnis went on to mourn the loss of the bad old days when professors and students could date, or at least sleep together. She explained, "It's been barely a year since the Great Prohibition took effect in my own workplace. Before that, students and professors could date whomever we wanted, but the next day we were off limits to one another, verboten, trafe, dangerous, and perhaps therefore all the more alluring." So some graduate students at her university were pretty upset by this article, especially since Kipnis questioned the right of anyone to condemn a consenting relationship between a professor and a student. And Kipnis cited a specific example from her own institution. So her student critics argued that by pointing the finger at people at her university and describing a true-to-life scenario, she had engaged in retaliatory behavior that fostered a hostile learning environment. She had violated the students' Title IX rights. This accusation led to a formal investigation, and both sides lawyered up, although the university eventually dropped its inquiry. Even so, Kipnis was exalted and lacerated in the popular press. One blogger summed it all up as the Kipnis Clown Show. Now, this kind of media frenzy might sound like something you'd want to avoid as a writer, but for the true polemicist, there are positive consequences to such attention. As a result of Kipnis's article and the ensuing backlash, many university and college administrators, faculty, and students wound up talking about sex and sexuality on their campuses, and whether Title IX was a help or a hindrance. And so whether you agree with her or not, it's clear that Kipnis's polemical essays are successful. By her own standard, Kipnis is effective at poking holes in cultural pieties, turning received wisdom on its head, and making dents in the usual story. Okay, so if you believe passionately in your own claims and arguments, and hope that the scales will drop from your reader's eyes after reading your work, then the polemic is just the thing. Deliberately provoking skeptical readers is an excellent way of getting them to respond to an argument. As any teacher or any parent already knows, once your naysayers try to mount counter-arguments to your claims, it does become possible to show them the holes in their thinking and maybe, just maybe, to change their minds. Before I conclude this lecture, let me add a final note about the kind of speaker you should aim to create in your own polemics. Specifically, I'd like to talk for a moment about the dangers of navel-gazing when writing polemical pieces. Now, it's true that we are living among the me generation, personified by the selfie and higher instances of narcissistic personality disorders than any generation before it. But that doesn't mean that your readers are primarily interested in hearing about you or about your life. Jonathan Edwards doesn't give his congregation a blow-by-blow of how he came to Jesus. Laura Kipnis doesn't offer a rundown of the men she's married or the ones she's cheated on. The power of the polemic comes from its incisive, surprising, and often combative arguments, rather than from a laundry list of private wounds and personal gripes. In the introduction to a collection of the best American essays, the late novelist and essayist David Foster Wallace pointed out that confessional writing is too often a symptom of something especially sick and narcissistic or voyeuristic about U.S. culture right now. Wallace concluded that readers just don't trust such writing. Why? Well, because as Wallace says, the sense I get from a lot of contemporary essays is that they have an unconscious and unacknowledged project, which is to make the writer seem as endlessly fascinating and important to the reader as they are to themselves. And I find most of them sad in a way I don't think their authors intend. So my point here is this. If you hope to be persuasive and credible in writing polemical essays, your motivations have to be ethical. And by ethical, I don't mean that you have to be pious or righteous. I mean that your ethos or credibility will be compromised if all you want to do is take someone down, or to complain and complain and complain, without caring about whether anyone else wants to hear your complaints. Jonathan Edwards' sermons were all fire and brimstone, but his motivations were ethical. He genuinely wanted to save souls. And while Laura Kipnis has made lots of people unhappy by saying professors should be able to date their students, her argument remains ethical. Why? Because it's really about personal freedom, the freedom to choose your own romantic partner. Now, there's no doubt that your opinions should be strong ones. A polemic requires that. But your goals in sharing these opinions must come out of a desire to connect with other people, to try and persuade them, to teach them something, even if you risk making them mad by telling them what they don't want to hear. In writing a polemical essay, you're still writing an essay, and the purpose of any essay is always the attempt to show or prove something. Within that act is the admission that you still don't know everything there is to know, even when you believe yourself to be on the right side of history. As Laura Kipnis says, polemics aren't necessarily unconflicted, nor are the polemicists themselves. Rhetoric and sentiment aren't always identical twins. So please read on in a conflicted and contradictory spirit. Such is the nature of the polemical essay.